$5. That number appeared in a formal research note, not a blog post, not a cable news prediction. A Goldman Sachs research note distributed to institutional clients Thursday morning that used the phrase $5 per gallon national average as its base case projection under a 60-day strait closure scenario. The strait has been closed for 22 days. 60 days is 38 days away. And the 3 diplomatic back channels confirmed active this week, Qatar, Oman, Switzerland, have produced no announced framework, no timeline, no signal of imminent resolution. $5 is not a worst-case number. It is the base case. Goldman's base case. Published, distributed, priced into futures markets before most Americans had their morning coffee. Wall Street did not panic over Iran because it is emotional. Wall Street does not panic. It recalculates. What happened Thursday was a recalculation, a systematic, institution-by-institution repricing of the duration and cost of a conflict whose official account and confirmed reality have been running in opposite directions for 22 days. The recalculation produced a VIX above 38, a second consecutive session of equity outflows, a crude oil front-month contract above $87, and a Goldman research note with a number on it that every American who drives a car, heats a home, or buys groceries will eventually encounter at a pump, on a utility bill, or on a receipt. The administration called it market volatility. Goldman called it $5. Those are not the same call. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly how $5 becomes the floor, not the ceiling. The specific supply, demand, and premium mechanisms that make the Goldman base case conservative, not alarmist, under the conditions that currently exist in global energy markets. I am going to walk you through what the recalculation on Thursday actually represents, confirmed by flow data from JP Morgan's institutional desk and commentary from the International Energy Agency published Thursday afternoon. Because understanding what institutional money is actually pricing tells you more about the real state of this conflict than any press briefing has. And I am going to tell you why the financial world you are living in today is measurably more dangerous to your household budget than the one you were living in a month ago. Because $5 at the pump is the visible number, and the invisible number embedded in everything else you buy is larger. Imagine you are a farmer. Your entire cost structure, fuel for equipment, fertilizer derived from natural gas, transportation for everything you grow, is tied to energy prices. Now imagine that the government that controls the waterway your supply chain depends on closes it, and the administration responsible for the closure spends 3 weeks telling you the situation is under control while the price of everything you need to operate climbs toward a number that makes your margins negative. You cannot plant less. You cannot harvest later. You cannot wait for diplomacy. You operate on a biological clock that does not adjust for geopolitical miscalculation. Hold that thought, because American farmers are not a metaphor in this story. They are inside it. And $5 per gallon is not a pump price problem for them. It is an operational survival problem, on their timeline, right now. Drop your answer in the comments before we go further. Is $5 gas the event that finally forces a diplomatic resolution? The economic pain that makes the exit framework real? Or does the administration hold the current posture, regardless of the pump price, because the political cost of the exit is still higher than the economic cost of the delay? I want your read on this before we go any further. Let us rewind the clock. Because $5 at the pump does not arrive without a sequence. It is built, layer by layer, mechanism by mechanism, on top of a baseline price environment that was already under pressure before the first American bomb fell on Iran. The pre-conflict national average was $3.42. That number was not low by historical standards. It was elevated by post-pandemic demand recovery, by OPEC production discipline, and by the structural underinvestment in refining capacity that followed the energy transition debate of the early 2020s. American refining capacity, the industrial infrastructure that converts crude oil into gasoline, is running at approximately 92% utilization. That is near the physical ceiling of what the existing infrastructure can process. There is no surge capacity. When crude input prices rise, as they have, from the pre-conflict baseline to $87 and climbing, refiners cannot compensate by running harder. They are already running at the limit. The price of the input goes directly into the price of the output. There is no buffer. There is no margin to absorb. The crude price increase passes through to the pump almost mechanically. The entire path to $5 gas was built on one compounding assumption that nobody in the administration accounted for in the public conflict framing: that American refining infrastructure, operating at 92% utilization against a crude input price elevated by a 38-day minimum Strait closure, has no mechanism to prevent the Goldman base case from becoming the pump reality. The assumption was that energy markets would stabilize quickly. They have not stabilized. They have compounded. Every day the Strait stays closed adds to the crude premium. Every dollar of crude premium passes through to the pump, and the refinery that is already at 92% has nowhere to go but the price. Receipt number 1. The IEA's Thursday afternoon emergency demand assessment, which is the most significant energy market document published this week and the one that got the least coverage in American media relative to its importance. According to the International Energy Agency's Emergency Situation Brief, published Thursday and confirmed by 3 energy correspondents who cover the IEA specifically, global spare production capacity, the buffer the world uses to replace disrupted supply from conflict zones, is currently at its lowest level since 2008. Stop right there. Spare production capacity is the world's energy shock absorber. When a supply disruption occurs, a Gulf closure, a pipeline attack, a production cut, the countries with spare capacity increase output to compensate, and the price spike is limited. In 2008, when spare capacity was last this low, an oil price shock produced a spike to $147 per barrel. The world is not at $147 today, but it is at $87 and climbing, in a spare capacity environment that has no historical precedent for absorbing a 22-day Strait closure at this production baseline. The IEA's brief used the phrase structurally exposed to describe the current global supply position. That phrase appears in a document published by the world's most authoritative energy monitoring body. It does not appear in any American government public statement from this week. The IEA sees what it sees. The administration says what it says. The pump price will eventually reflect one of those 2 accounts. It is already clear which one it is reflecting. The punchline: the IEA publishes its emergency briefs publicly. The document is available. The phrase, structurally exposed, is on page 3. Receipt number 2, the household transmission mechanism. And this is the one that should make your blood boil. The $5 number in the Goldman note is a national average projection. National averages are mathematical constructs. They include California, where gas is already above $5 in most markets. They include Wyoming and Mississippi, where lower state taxes keep prices lower. The national average conceals the regional reality. In the Midwest, the industrial heartland where this channel's audience lives and works in the highest concentration, the regional blend requirements, the transportation distances from Gulf Coast refineries, and the lower income levels relative to coastal markets mean the Midwest typically runs above the national average during price spikes, not below it. Here is the part that should make your blood boil. The government's own Energy Information Administration published a regional price impact model in its February outlook, before this conflict, that showed Midwestern retail gasoline prices running 8 to 12 cents above the national average during a sustained Gulf supply disruption. The government modeled this before it happened. The model said the people who can least afford a sustained price spike will absorb a price above the already alarming national average. Then the conflict began. Then the Strait closed. Then the crude premium reached $35 above baseline. And the administration called the market volatility and the Goldman number $5, and the press secretary said unacceptable. The people who built the model that predicted the Midwest would be hardest hit are the same people employed by the government that created the conditions the model was designed to describe. The EIA saw it coming, they published it, and the policy response was a word. If this channel is giving you the financial architecture of this crisis in a way you cannot find assembled anywhere else, you are already ahead of the conversation most Americans will be forced to have at the pump in approximately 4 to 6 weeks. What is still coming in this video is the part that goes beyond gas: the food price mechanism, the small business cost structure, and the retirement compounding problem that most financial media is not connecting to the pump price. Hit subscribe right now. This story has a direct line to your household budget, and it is moving faster than the news cycle is tracking it. Now look at what the people responsible for this price trajectory are actually saying. Because the distance between the official characterization and the Goldman base case is a distance that people with money to manage cannot afford to pretend does not exist, even if people with offices to protect can. The White House economic advisor appeared on Thursday and said, and this is a direct quote, "American energy production is at record levels, and we have tools to manage any short-term market disruption." Record production. Tools to manage. Short-term. He said that on a day when crude closed at $87, when the Goldman $5 note had been in institutional circulation for 8 hours, when the IEA had just published a document using the phrase structurally exposed, and when the VIX was above 38 for the second consecutive session. And his analysis is record production, tools, short-term. A congressman from an oil-producing state. A congressman whose constituents are watching crude prices rise and calculating whether higher pump prices at home offset the revenue gains for domestic producers, was asked whether Congress should demand the release of strategic petroleum reserve supplies to cap the price spike. His response was, "Let the market work." The market is working. It worked its way to $87. It is working its way toward Goldman's $5 base case. These are not serious people providing serious energy policy stewardship during a structural supply disruption that their own government modeled and predicted. They are officials whose public statements have a 4 to 6 week lag before the people watching this video encounter the consequences at the pump. Here is the part that should keep every American household awake tonight. Because $5 per gallon is the headline number. The number underneath it, the number embedded invisibly in every product you buy, every service you use, every bill you pay, is larger. And it is arriving on a timeline that runs ahead of any diplomatic resolution. The diesel transmission is the mechanism most people do not think about, because most people do not buy diesel. But diesel is the fuel that moves everything you buy. Every truck that delivers groceries, every freight train that moves raw materials, every delivery van that brings packages to your door runs on diesel. Diesel futures tracked crude's Thursday move with a 96% correlation, tighter than gasoline futures, because diesel demand is less elastic. You can drive less. Trucking companies cannot deliver less. Their fuel cost goes directly into their operating cost. Their operating cost goes directly into the freight rate they charge the companies that ship goods. The freight rate goes directly into the landed cost of every product those companies sell. The landed cost goes directly into the retail price. This chain is not theoretical, it is mechanical. It runs in approximately 6 to 10 weeks from a crude price move to a grocery receipt. The crude price move already happened. The grocery receipt is 6 to 10 weeks away. American households will experience the $5 gas story twice, once at the pump in 4 to 6 weeks, and once at the grocery store in 6 to 10. Most people will not connect the second event to the first, but they are the same event. They are the same crude premium running through 2 different transmission channels on 2 slightly different timelines. So what does this actually mean for you? Not for energy traders, not for hedge funds pricing Gulf risk, for the person filling their tank, paying their bills, and watching their retirement account in the same week. If you drive to work, the Goldman base case says $4.29 per gallon by week 6 of the Strait closure was the floor projection before Thursday's crude move to $87. The updated floor, repriced against Thursday's close, is closer to $4.50 on a 45-day closure timeline. On a 60-day timeline, Goldman's base case for the $5 projection, you are at $5 on the national average and above it in the Midwest, above it in the Mountain West, above it in every market where state tax rates and transportation costs run above the national floor. The average American household buys approximately 57 gallons of gasoline per month. At $5 versus the pre-conflict $3.42, that is $91 per month in additional fuel cost, per household. Every month the Strait stays closed. That is not a rounding error. That is a car payment. That is a month's worth of groceries for a family of 2. That is the difference between a utility bill that is manageable and one that requires a decision between heat and food for the households at the lower end of the fixed income spectrum that makes up a significant portion of this channel's audience. If you are a small business owner, a restaurant, a contractor, a retailer, a service provider whose operating costs have any energy component, Your cost structure was already squeezed by post-pandemic input price inflation before this conflict began. The energy premium now running in global markets does not spare small businesses. It hits them harder than large corporations, because large corporations have hedging programs, long-term supply contracts, and balance sheet depth to absorb a price spike while renegotiating. Small businesses buy at spot. They pay the pump price for fleet fuel. They pay the freight rate that reflects Thursday's diesel move. They pay the utility bill that will reflect the LNG premium in the next billing cycle. And they cannot easily pass those costs forward to customers who are simultaneously absorbing their own household energy cost spike. The margin compression hitting small businesses in the next 60 days is not a projection. It is the arithmetic of what happens when the input costs of a sector with thin margins increase by 15 to 20% in a 6-week window. Some businesses will raise prices, some will cut hours, some will evaluate whether the math still works. This channel's audience is full of people who own those businesses, work at those businesses, or depend on them. The Goldman $5 note landed in their cost structure on Thursday morning. If you are within 15 years of retirement and your savings are in broadly diversified equity accounts, the VIX above 38 environment that closed Thursday is not a number you watch. It is a mechanism acting on your account. Target date funds, the default investment vehicle for most 401k plans, use volatility-triggered rebalancing that reduces equity exposure automatically when the VIX sustains above 35. That rebalancing happened Wednesday. It may happen again if Thursday's close sustains into Friday. Each rebalancing event locks in a portion of the drawdown at the lower allocation. The recovery, when it comes, starts from a lower equity position than you held before the rebalancing sequence began. If you are 15 years from retirement, you have time to recover from a rebalancing sequence. If you are 5 years out, and a significant portion of the 45 to 70 demographic watching this is 5 years out or less, the sequence of returns mathematics are compressed in a way that does not fully recover regardless of what the market does after the conflict resolves. This is not catastrophizing. This is the actuarial table. The table does not negotiate with press briefings. If you are a farmer, a rancher, or anyone whose livelihood depends on agricultural production, diesel for equipment, natural gas for fertilizer production, propane for grain drying, transportation for everything you grow or raise. The American Farm Bureau estimated last year that every 10-cent increase in diesel prices costs the average American farm operation between $8,000 and $12,000 annually in additional fuel costs. Thursday's diesel move represents approximately a 15-cent increase above the pre-conflict baseline. Do that math. On top of an already compressed agricultural margin environment, on a biological timeline that does not pause for diplomatic backchannels in Qatar and Oman and Switzerland to reach a framework agreement. Planting season does not wait. Harvest does not wait. The farm cost structure is absorbing a conflict it had no vote in starting and no mechanism for ending. The administration did not create the conditions for $5 gas to protect American farmers, American small business owners, American commuters, or American retirees within 15 years of a drawdown window. It created those conditions because it built a conflict on a 72-hour assumption with no refining capacity buffer analysis, no spare production capacity assessment, no regional price impact modeling incorporated into the public framing, even though the EIA had already published that modeling, and no exit condition that anyone in the administration has stated publicly in 22 days. The $5 number is not Goldman's fault. Goldman is describing the arithmetic. The arithmetic was created in the 40-minute meeting where the exit plan was not required. Here is the hard truth. $5 per gallon is not an energy crisis. It is an accountability crisis wearing an energy price tag. Every mechanism that produces it was documented before it happened. The IEA's spare capacity assessment, the EIA's refinery utilization ceiling, the EIA's Midwest regional premium model, the Goldman Sachs transmission calculation linking straight closure duration to pump price outcome. These were published documents, available before the conflict began, describing precisely the conditions that now exist. The conflict was authorized anyway, the strait closed, the crude premium compounded, and the people who read those documents and made the authorization decision are on television calling it market volatility. Iran did not create $5 gas. The decision to start a conflict with an undisclosed cost, no exit condition, and a refining infrastructure already running at its capacity ceiling created $5 gas. Iran provided the occasion. The administration provided the mechanism. Goldman just did the math. Where does this go from here? I see three paths. The first I would call the price ceiling diplomacy scenario. $5 gas, or the credible approach of it, becomes the forcing function that the formal diplomatic process could not be. The administration, facing a domestic political cost calculation that changes at $4.50 per gallon and becomes urgent at $5, accelerates the back-channel process in Qatar. A framework agreement is announced within the next 10 to 15 days. The strait reopens on a phased timeline. Crude pulls back from 87 toward the low 70s as the closure risk premium deflates. Gas prices follow, but they follow slowly because the insurance premiums that were installed in Gulf tanker operations during the closure period do not normalize for months, and because the refinery input cost pass-through that is already in the distribution system does not reverse immediately when crude falls. Even in this best case, consumers will be paying above $4 per gallon for 60 to 90 days after a framework agreement is announced. The pump does not reset the moment the diplomats shake hands. The supply chain has memory, and the permanent damage in this best case is the demonstrated proposition that $5 gas is achievable, not as a worst-case scenario, but as a base case that a 22-day strait closure can produce in the current structural environment. Every future adversary, every future OPEC negotiation, every future Gulf tension event will be evaluated against that demonstrated floor. The leverage has been established. It does not disappear when this crisis does. The second path is what energy economists are privately calling the compounding event. The strait stays closed beyond 45 days. Goldman's base case activates. $5 gas is not a projection, but a price on a sign at a station near you. The Federal Reserve is simultaneously constrained. Inflation from energy pass-through prevents the rate cuts that would cushion the equity market impact. And the compounding effect of above $5 gas on consumer spending data begins appearing in real-time economic indicators. Consumer spending drives approximately 70% of American GDP. A household spending $91 more per month on gasoline, before the grocery and utility pass-through effects compound on top of it, is a household spending less on everything else. Retail sales data for the period 6 to 8 weeks from the strait closure, when it is published, will show the contraction. The contraction will feed into earnings guidance revisions. The revisions will feed into equity valuations. The equity market will absorb a third round of institutional repricing on top of Wednesday's 1,200 points and Thursday's second session of outflows. This is the scenario that should genuinely keep every American household focused on the diplomatic timeline in Qatar, because the back-channel process is not an abstraction. It is the variable that determines whether $5 is the ceiling or the floor. The third path is the one nobody wants to say out loud. The $5 gas reality, arriving at the pump in approximately 4 to 6 weeks, produces a domestic political environment in which the administration faces simultaneous pressure from its own coalition. Farmers, small business owners, suburban commuters, retirees watching retirement accounts draw down, to accept terms the administration has publicly said it will never accept. The public position: total Iranian nuclear disarmament, no negotiation with the regime, collides with the private reality. JCPOA-level enrichment limits being conveyed through Switzerland, 3 active back channels, an exit framework being drafted in the Pentagon. When that collision becomes public, and at $5 gas it becomes public because reporters with gas station receipts have a story that writes itself, the administration is forced to either acknowledge the gap between the public position and the diplomatic reality, or to escalate militarily to avoid the appearance of having negotiated under economic pressure. An administration escalating a military engagement specifically to avoid the domestic political optics of a pump price forcing a diplomatic concession is not a scenario that any responsible government should be navigating. But the War Powers notification was never filed. The cost estimate was never submitted. The exit framework was drafted in a secure room at 3 in the morning. Normal left the building a long time ago, and there are no more guardrails. Here is what I know for certain. Regardless of which of those 3 paths plays out, regardless of what crude does Friday, regardless of whether the Cutter channel produces a framework announcement next week. The structural vulnerability that made $5 gas achievable as a base case has been permanently exposed. Before this conflict, $5 gas was a worst-case, low-probability scenario attached to a specific set of extreme conditions. After this conflict, $5 gas is a documented base case achievable under conditions that a 22-day straight closure in a low spare capacity environment produces mechanically. That knowledge is now in the market. It is in the IEA brief. It is in the Goldman note. It is in the EIA regional model. It is in the futures curves that energy companies and transportation companies and food companies will use to price their products and hedge their costs for the next decade. The vulnerability was always there. This conflict demonstrated it. And demonstrated vulnerabilities do not go back to being theoretical. They become the new floor for every future energy security calculation by every government, every corporation, and every household that pays an energy bill. Everywhere except the podium, where someone is still deciding how many times the word unacceptable has been used. The pump is not looking at the next press briefing. It is looking at the crude futures curve. Right now, the crude futures curve is pricing a conflict whose duration is uncertain, whose cost is undisclosed, whose exit condition is unannounced, and whose official account is running in direct contradiction of the Goldman base case. The pump will reflect that curve in approximately 4 to 6 weeks. The grocery receipt will reflect it in 6 to 10. And the retirement account is already reflecting it in real time, in the VIX reading and the target date fund rebalancing algorithm, and the sequence of returns mathematics that do not wait for press briefings to confirm what the futures market already priced on Thursday morning. I want to leave you with 2 questions. The first, when $5 per gallon arrives at the pump, not as a Goldman projection, but as a number on a sign at your local station, and the same officials who called this decisive, who said Iran was set back 50 years, who described the IEA's structurally exposed assessment as short-term market volatility, are asked to account for the gap between what they promised and what you are paying. What accountability mechanism exists for that gap, and who is supposed to enforce it? The second question is the one that should follow every American to the pump for the next 60 days. When you fill your tank at $4.50 or $4.80 or $5, and you do the math, $91 per month, $1,100 per year, compounding through your grocery bill and your utility bill and your small business's operating cost and your retirement account's volatility exposure. Will the people who cheered for this operation, who said the market would sort itself out, who called Goldman's base case volatility, will they still say it was worth it? Drop your answers in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe because the 45-day straight closure threshold is now 23 days away, and when it hits, the Goldman base case becomes the Goldman reality. You need to be here when that number lands. This story is not slowing down. Do not look away.